Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea sees a drop in employment for a seventh month in a row. Almost 400,000 jobs lost in September. Again, the hardest hit sectors were food and lodging. South Korea is ranked #1 in the OECD for its digital government, winning praise for the way public services are provided online and the sharing of data to make the public sector more efficient. And South Korea reports fewer than 50 new cases of COVID-19. The authorities calling for caution this weekend, though, with bars and clubs opening back up and crowds going to see the autumn foliage. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea reported fewer than 50 cases of COVID-19 today. There had been more than 100 for several days in a row amid concerns that it had spread during the recent holidays. A risk now could be the crowds heading to the mountains, especially the national parks, to see the autumn leaves. Han Sung-woo reports.
South Korea saw the number of daily COVID-19 infections drop below 50 for the first time in over 2 weeks this Friday. Of the 47 new cases reported, 41 were locally transmitted, with Seoul and the surrounding areas accounting for most of these cases. These include cluster infections at a pub in Incheon, a hospital and funeral house in Seoul, and from social gatherings on the east coast of Gangwon-do province.
Cluster infections are still popping up from social gatherings and at places where high-risk facilities are concentrated, so it's early to relax.
Another concern is the increasing amount of tourists and hikers heading to the mountains to enjoy the autumn leaves amid the recent relaxation of social distancing guidelines to level 1. Starting Saturday, national parks will operate under special measures for the fall to prevent a potential spread of the virus. The number of critically ill patients has risen to 85, and the total number of cases now stands at slightly over 25,000. COVID-19 has claimed 2 more lives, bringing the country's death toll to 441. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
According to South Korea's National Security Advisor, Seo-hoon, who met Thursday in Washington with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, there is no difference of opinion between the U.S. and South Korea on the issue of declaring a formal end to the Korean War. Combat in the war ended in 1953, but only with an armistice, and giving it a formal end has been a key policy of President Moon Jae-in. Kim Min-ji reports.
A declaration to formally end the Korean War was always on the negotiating table and part of the denuclearization process. That's according to South Korea's National Security Advisor Seo-hoon following talks with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Washington on Thursday. Speaking to reporters, Seo said there's no difference of opinion between Seoul and Washington on the matter.
The issue was always on the negotiating table. There exists no difference of opinion between Seoul and Washington on the matter.
Seo said the issue is about which stage in the process it should happen and how closely linked it should be to North Korea's denuclearization. His comments are likely in reference to claims of South Korea seeking to declare an end to the Korean War, regardless of progress on denuclearization talks. President Moon Jae-in has recently repeated calls for an end-of-war declaration to reignite the stalled peace drive. When asked if his visit was to rekindle diplomacy on the Korean peninsula ahead of the U.S. presidential election, Seo said Seoul-Washington relations must be maintained regardless of the vote. He also stressed that inter-Korean ties don't just involve the 2 Koreas, saying every issue needs to be discussed with the U.S. and neighboring countries.
We have been closely coordinating on inter-Korean relations or North Korea's nuclear negotiations with Secretary Pompeo since he was the CIA director.
It was Seo's first U.S. trip since he assumed his post in July. Seo said he has had productive discussions on a wide range of bilateral issues and has shared evaluations of the conditions on the Korean peninsula and views on ways to manage the situation. On Wednesday, he met his U.S. counterpart, Robert O'Brien. Seo will depart for Seoul on Friday. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
New data show that South Korea had fewer people employed in September for a 7th month in a row. The finance minister, however, says the figures will start to improve in October. Ji-young has this report.
For 7 months in a row, the monthly employment figures in South Korea have been worse than they were the year earlier. According to Statistics Korea on Friday, 392,000 fewer people were in employment in September compared to the same time the previous year. That is a fall of 1.4% on year, the largest drop in 4 months.
The drop in September's job figures reflects the resurgence of COVID-19 infections since mid-August and the impact of the prolonged pandemic.
And 2.4 million people took a temporary leave of absence from work in September, which is the most for the month of September since the statistics were first compiled in 2003. It was also up 13.6% on year. The largest job losses were in the restaurants and lodging sectors, which had 225,000 fewer jobs last month than a year earlier. That's about a 10% fall. The finance minister said at a ministerial meeting on Friday that the recent surge in infections has halted the recovery in the job market. But he added that the situation is better than back in March and April and that October's figures are also expected to show an improvement. He also announced plans to issue discount coupons in 8 areas, such as lodging and tourism, to boost spending and revitalize regional economies.
The plan to issue discount coupons in 8 areas, which have been suspended due to the resurgence of COVID-19, will resume after discussing the details, including the dates and preventative measures with the related ministries.
He also said the government will push forward its economic relief packages to help industries adversely affected by the pandemic. 엄지영, Arirang News.
From doing your taxes to applying for a business license, these days many of our interactions with the government happen online. This is part of so-called digital government, and in this field, South Korea has been ranked #1 by the OECD. Our PNG reports.
South Korea has been named the top country in the OECD for digital government. According to the OECD's 2019 Digital Government Index report, South Korea was ranked #1 among the 33 member states, followed by UK, Colombia, Denmark, and Japan. The OECD said the top 5 highest-ranked countries have made consistent and comprehensive efforts to implement a digital government. This includes using technology to change the way the public sector operates, such as sharing data between public sector organizations.
This clearly acknowledges the government's efforts to provide administrative services to the citizens digitally. This includes promptly handing out COVID-19 emergency disaster relief funds to overcome the economic crisis.
South Korea scored especially well for the amount of effort toward digital reform made by the government. It also ranked the highest for delivering services digitally to its citizens. The OECD said this digital paradigm shift has become crucial due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as lockdown periods forced public sector organizations to rely on digital systems. PNG, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Good afternoon, Professor. Thanks for coming on.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, data show Korea, as we just heard, shed around 400,000 jobs in September compared to a year earlier, and the number of people employed has been falling since March. Tell us about these numbers, Professor, and your outlook.
As coronavirus pandemic shock continues, a decline in the number of the employed also continues, starting from March of this year. In September, Korean economy lost about 400,000 jobs, and unemployment rate roses by 0.5% to 3.6%. Particularly, the number of young workers, temporary workers, and workers in accommodation and food service decreased in larger scale. So these workers are the hardest hit people by coronavirus pandemic.
Well, South Korea's population is projected to start shrinking next year. So this means a lot of potential changes to things like military service, pensions, and so on. What kind of changes do you think we need?
Korean economy is experiencing the most rapid increase in old population in the world. And at the same time, the birth rate is the lowest in the world, with less than 1 kid per fertile female. And naturally, total population begins to decrease from next year, and it changes everything in Korea, like number of college students, number of military soldiers, and younger generations heavier support on older generation. In the short run, Korea will have to have more immigration from foreign countries to avoid rapid population decrease. But in the long run, there should be more effective full-scale population policies.
Well, turning to the stock market, Wall Street was down for a third straight session on Thursday, weighed down by jobs numbers in the U.S. Also, the fact that Europe now has overtaken America in the number of daily cases of COVID-19. What's the story in the global markets?
Along with strong resurgence of coronavirus in Eurozone, shutdowns and lockdowns are intensified in Europe, particularly in UK and France. And in U.S., unexpectedly, the number of unemployment claims increased in a large scale in early October. So all these gloomy situation on coronavirus pandemic decreased U.S. market and European markets. Dow Jones Industrial decreased by 0.1%, and Nasdaq decreased also by 0.5% in yesterday's market.
Now here in Korea, the Kospi was sharply lower today too, though it did start out a little higher in the morning. What happened in the local market?
Domestic market decreased today due to increasing concerns on shutdowns in major economies like U.S. and Eurozone. Kospi decreased by 0.8% today, and Kosdaq also decreased by 1.3% today. In both domestic markets, foreign investors and domestic institutional investors have led the market with big sales.
And now the Bank of Korea has released data on exports showing that the price of exports has continued to fall since February, but the price of imports also falling for a third month in a row. Tell us about that, and what do you make of these numbers?
According to Bank of Korea, export price decreased by 0.3%, and import price also decreased by 1.3% in September. Broadly speaking, the major reason for decreasing export and import prices are related to global trade shrink over coronavirus pandemic. But another two major seasonal factors are appreciating Korean won or decreasing $1 exchange rate, and oil price decreases. $1 exchange rate decreased by almost 1% in September, and international oil price also dropped by 6% in the same month.
Yeah, the exchange rate certainly has come down quite a lot since the peak in the pandemic. All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.
The head of OPEC, Mohammed Barkindo, has assured markets once again that oil prices will not crash like they did back in the spring. Speaking Thursday at the Energy Intelligence Forum, Barkindo said the partnership between OPEC and non-OPEC countries will continue to ensure that that doesn't happen. Back in April, members of OPEC and their allies reached a deal to cut oil production by 9.7 million barrels per day in May and June, their deepest cut in history. The OPEC chief also said he thinks there will be a strong rebound in the global economy next year once there's a vaccine. According to a survey, the favorite comfort food of South Koreans is tteokbokki, the rice cakes served in a spicy red sauce and often found at stalls that serve street food. The survey was conducted by the Seoul city government on around 10,000 residents. Tteokbokki as a comfort food was followed by fried chicken, kimchi stew, grilled pork belly, and ginseng chicken soup. Similar foods were also chosen in a survey of 50 foreign residents. The surveys were conducted as part of a promotional event for local food called Taste of Seoul, to be held from November 11th to the 15th, which the city hopes will bring comfort to people in the pandemic. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.